1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former general during the Second World War, wins the presidential election. At the same time, the international scientific community begins preparing for what they are calling the International Geophysical Year. No word comes out from the newly elected Eisenhower administration about the Geophysical Year, but quietly behind closed doors, the Air Force, Strategic Air Command, the NACA, and one very persistent former Nazi rocket scientist, Wernher von Braun, beseech President Eisenhower with requests to launch an Earth-circling satellite. The Air Force and SAC talk about the importance of a satellite as a military asset, citing the use of them as a relay to communicate with soldiers, bombers, and ships too far away from land for direct contact, or in wartime, where standard communication methods are shut down. The NACA stresses the scientific importance, directly citing the Geophysical Year and urging the President to take advantage of this opportunity for the scientific community. Von Braun takes a different approach. He writes to the President that if the United States did not take the opportunity to lead in space, then, in all likelihood, the Soviet Union would. He tells the President that his team can put an American satellite into orbit before the end of 1957, if he had only the go-ahead from his leadership. At first, Eisenhower ignores them, but as the Korean War ends, one of his advisors offers an idea to help settle into the new peace, to announce that the U.S. will be participating in the Geophysical Year in some capacity. Taking inspiration from these letters, in 1965, President Eisenhower has James Haggerty announce on his behalf, "I am now announcing that the President has approved plans by this country for going ahead with the launching of a small, unmanned Earth-circling satellite, as part of the United States participation in the International Geophysical Year, which takes place between July of 1957 and December 1958. This program will, for the first time in history, enable scientists throughout the world to make sustained observations in the regions beyond Earth's atmosphere. The President expressed personal gratification that the American program will provide scientists of all nations this important and unique opportunity for the advancement of science." 4 days later, a Soviet physicist named Leonid Sedov announces that the Soviet Union will also be attempting to launch a satellite for the Geophysical Year. The announcement of the Soviet participation in the program does not surprise the United States at all. But after the Soviet announcement, Eisenhower meets with advisors from across the Air Force, Navy, Army, and civilian sector to discuss how best to win this race. In this meeting, Eisenhower is quoted stating, "The satellite cannot be launched using military weapon systems. It must be made by Americans, no Germans, and must be launched before the Soviets get their damn thing up there. We cannot be made a fool of in the international community." Several proposals would come to Eisenhower's desk, but it would be one from the Air Force that would pique his interest the most. It was called Astra. It utilized some of the knowledge built from the Atlas program, but was built with the sole purpose of launching satellites. Named after the wife of the Titan Atlas, it was a fitting title. It would be Astra that would lead the United States to the stars. While Atlas held up the skies and kept the Soviet Union at bay, Astra would go out, and her children, the Pleiades, would teach the world about space, just as the Pleiades would teach Dionysus. Eisenhower gave the Air Force till the end of 1958 to launch the first satellite into space. Welcome everyone to Ad Astra, my playthrough of Realism Overhaul, Realistic Progression in Kerbal Space Program. I'm playing the scenario 1957 light satellites, playing as the United States, so I'm only going to be using US parts. And my goal is to try and get all the way to a moon landing and maybe even stretch it for a crewed Mars landing at some point, way down the line. We're going to start off with the launch of Astra I. It's April 22nd, 1957, 6 months before the Soviet Union has a chance to launch Sputnik 1. Astras are Atlas-like rockets with 2 Atlas sustainer engines on the main booster. They are helped off the pad by the same Vanguard rocket that the Navy developed to launch their first satellite. We're going to quickly start by heading out to the pad and launching our first one, Astra I. You'll notice that the craft kind of falls slowly. I forgot to check the thrust-to-weight ratio, the sea level thrust-to-weight ratio, and it wasn't quite above 1, but that's okay, because it slowly starts to lift up in a matter of a few seconds, and then the rocket does eventually clear the pad and make its way into space. On this flight, everything seemed to be going okay, but then
2 minutes into the launch, one of the central engines fails and shuts off. With the help from the boosters, the rocket is able to keep itself aligned for now, but they are only attached for a few more seconds, and shortly after they fall away, the rocket loses control, and range safety has to destroy it before it even clears 35 kilometers. This sets the program back several months, but we still do have a chance to beat the Soviets later this year, as I'm always building 2 of every single rocket I try and launch in order to lower the amount of time it takes to recover from these potential failures.
Despite the fact that the United States first broke the sound barrier 10 years ago in 1947, the NACA decided to move from Edwards Air Force Base to an airfield on the coast of Florida, right next to the new Astra launch facility. Participating with the Air Force, the NACA and Air Force don't announce it yet, but they begin the steps to prepare pilots for potential space flights. To this end, they build a brand new X-3, an extended version of the X-1, to attain extreme altitudes. The pilots selected are not told of the eventual goal to put a man in space using an air-launched rocket plane. But first, the new X-3 must be put through its paces. The first test, taking it above the sound barrier at the controls, is Benjamin Martin, an Air Force test pilot. Benjamin, call sign Duck, is assigned the mission to take the X-3 to an altitude of 10 miles and a speed of 1,000 miles per hour, to push the vehicle through its paces and ensure that it is ready for faster and higher flights for the future. Benjamin names the X-3 the Amazing Avalon in honor of his wife.
So I've run a couple of tests with the new RP1 system, and since I'm starting in 1957 with a ton of technology already unlocked, I need to make sure that I can have plenty of funds and can farm reputation. So that's what I decided to build the X-3 for. It would fly quite a bit, jumping between our 2 test pilots, Benjamin Martin and Stanislaw Volodin. I was hoping that these 2 would eventually become some of the first astronauts that fly into space very soon in a couple of episodes. But I decided to start using the early X-Plane program to help farm reputation. Ben goes first on taking the X-3 out, and he completes his mission beautifully. His job was just to get it above 15 kilometers and maintain speeds greater than 450 meters a second, although I forgot to load in the supersonic flight research experiment for him, so I got no science from this flight. It doesn't matter though, since I got to 15 kilometers, I was able to stay faster than the speed of sound for the required time. That is mission complete, and I'm actually able to unlock some new leaders for my program. All Ben has to do is safely bring the craft back to the runway, which is not a problem for him, as he is one of the most skilled pilots in the Air Force at this time. Stan will get his chance to fly the Amazing Avalon next. With his mission, it pretty much just copies Ben's flight. He needs to get up to 320 meters per second and fly to an altitude of 12.5 kilometers. Only this time he does have the supersonic flight experiment package. I guess since it was the first flight of the X-3 on that last flight, the NACA wouldn't want to overload their test pilot with experiment operations, so they decided to fly it on the second flight, where they would just repeat it but with the experiments. Stan will perform the research while repeating what Ben has accomplished. Stan won't have it easy though. He encounters one of the first of a reoccurring issue with the X-3, in that it suffers an engine failure on one of the engines. That lower engine, I guess, when engineers or technicians drop tools while making repairs, I guess one of them hits it, and that causes weird things to happen in flight, preventing it from firing sometimes. I don't know, I'm making this up as I go along. Despite these issues, Stan makes another amazing test flight. He's not only able to complete the mission, but bring the X-3 back to land on the runway so that engineers on the ground can diagnose the issue and hopefully prevent it in the future. Subtle foreshadowing, they don't.
26 July 1957. An Aether rocket rests once again on the pad at Cape Canaveral. On top sits the Pleiades 1 satellite. This small satellite has on board a mass spectroscopy experiment, which is meant to probe the exosphere and understand its chemical makeup. As well, it has a set of solar panels to extend the life of the satellite and try and gather as much data as possible. No word has come out from the Soviet Union about their own rocket and space launch program. The United States is uncertain Will this be the last chance they have at beating the Soviet Union into space? All hopes of a massive team of engineers, scientists, and administrators who all fought and worked to get that rocket to the pad rests on this launch. The memory of the previous attempt is still fresh in their minds. If this does not work, then the United States may be second in the satellite race.
As you can see, we've done it. In this playthrough, we have beaten the Soviet Union to the first ever satellite. Pleiades 1 sits in an eccentric orbit around the Earth and beams down valuable science about the exosphere. Some scientists' hypotheses are confirmed, some are proven false, but the satellite worked. We lucked out as the issues that plagued the previous launch does not appear and allows the spacecraft to safely reach orbit. Even the infamous early AJ-10 and its proclivity to ignition failures fires up and burns for a full duration, and the Araby designed to put the satellite into orbit gives it the final push it needs to get all the way into space. We still have the issue of low thrust-to-weight ratio at launch, but to fix that, with the science gained from this first satellite, I'm able to research and unlock 1958 Solids Research Node. With this, we will be able to upgrade our Astra rocket to be able to get off the pad much quicker. Something that I find really funny that you'll notice with other satellites like this one is that since it's spin stabilized and with the solar panels on the front of the satellite, it's not balanced perfectly. It has a bistable state, which now and then, just like this T handle on the ISS video, it will flip around and then stabilize again, which is really cool to see. Up next, we are back in the X3, pushing it further, faster, and higher, all at the same time. Ben is back at the controls and he is told to take the aircraft at 20 kilometers and get it going 550 meters per second. While he performs this mission perfectly, he encounters some issues on the way back. He decided to save a little bit of fuel to use in landing in case he needed a small boost, but encountered that same issue with that same engine. He burned through the remainder of his fuel, but it isn't enough, and he realizes he's coming in short and won't be able to make it to the runway. He brings his aircraft down to land just west of the main runway. Despite succeeding in the mission and bringing the aircraft back safely, Ben feels incredibly embarrassed by the fact that he wasn't able to land the aircraft on the runway. This loses us a nice bonus for the program, but also hurts his pride the most. 31st of August, 1957. The brand new upgraded Astra rocket, now with 4 Castor solid rocket boosters, sits on the launch pad. Its mission, launch into a special orbit, called a polar orbit. With regular orbits, the spacecraft will travel in the same direction as the planet's spin. For Earth, this would be west to east. But a polar orbit will have the direction of travel taking it over the north and south poles of the planet. The reason these orbits are useful is because the satellites will eventually pass over every part of the Earth. Useful for Earth observation satellites such as spy satellites or ground scanning research satellites. Astra II, with the Pleiades 2 satellite, aims to prove that these orbits are reachable. With the Castor 4 solid rocket motors, the rocket practically leaps off the pad. It first points itself off the coast. In case of a failure, the teams would want to have the debris from the destroyed rocket to fly into the ocean. But after the Castors are released and we get faster, we could start to point a little more north. We once again luck out with the early AJ-10 as it ignites and we're able to safely make it to a polar orbit around the Earth.
October 8, 1957. With the embarrassment of coming in second place, the Soviet Union decides to go ahead of schedule. Its original plan was to launch a small spherical satellite that would send down a series of beeps to show that it had made it into orbit. This would no longer be enough. It is removed from the R-7 rocket that was originally going to launch it. Instead, a new payload is loaded onto the rocket. On board what was supposed to be Sputnik 2, but is now Sputnik 1, is Laika the dog. She is launched into low Earth orbit, alive, and the Soviet Union's announced that success. Unknown to the United States, she would die shortly after launch, after a failure of her heating system. The United States sees the success of the Sputnik as a sign that the Soviet Union is not going to stop with just launching satellites. They intend to launch a man into space. Leaders of the Air Force Space Program and the NACA meet with President Eisenhower to discuss the development. It is in this meeting that the first drafts for what would become the National Space Act are written. While the President works with a team of congressmen, senators, and advisors to finalize the act, he tasked NACA and the Air Force to begin researching the feasibility of putting a man into space before 1963.
14th of October, 1957. While the United States congratulates the Soviet Union on their first satellite and the victory of putting the first animal into orbit, the Aethra Pleiades program carries on. Another Aethra 2 rocket rests on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. Its mission, launch the first solar-powered satellite, an achievement that has technically already been accomplished, but this vehicle has a specific orbit in mind, getting into an orbit with a periapsis above 300 kilometers. And it's during this flight that the choice of using the early AJ-10 comes to bite us. The engine fails to ignite after the first stage separation. Luckily, we have more than enough fuel in the Aero-B stage to potentially save the mission. We aren't going to get into the correct orbit, but we can at least put the satellite into orbit and hopefully salvage something from this flight. We spin up the boosters, fire the Aero-B engine, burning it to completion. We are able to get the spacecraft into an incredibly eccentric orbit, but in orbit nonetheless. The satellite would be called Pleiades 2B in order to save the Pleiades 3 name for a satellite that succeeds in this mission. So there was one other flight of the X3 before this one, but I forgot to record it, or OBS didn't record it. I'm not sure which one. Anyway, after the difficulties of our previous flight, it is now time for the final flight of the X3. Benjamin is once again back in control of the amazing Avalon. His mission is simple: reach an altitude greater than 40 kilometers and return to the launch site. We're reaching the limits of what the X3 can accomplish, as pushing it any higher will risk the pilot losing control of the aircraft and causing an uncontrolled descent. Something that I do not want to experience. So while the next stage of the experimental rocket planes is in development, after this flight we will turn to performing more jet-based research with some of the fighter jet-like aircraft. The final flight of the X3 goes smoothly. At first, Ben second guesses the engine cutoff point to reach the target altitude and begins to descend too soon. Going against mission planners, he relights the engines, pushing the throttles as far as they will go. Fighting with gravity, he gets the aircraft to begin rising again, and just as he runs out of fuel, he makes it to the target altitude. But now a new problem arises. He has traveled much further than planned, and is now flying a glider. He will have to conserve as much energy as possible and fly across the entire Florida peninsula if he hopes to land back on the runway. Incredibly, despite the doubts of the flight controllers who talk him down, Ben clears the cloud layer, coming in actually too fast to land. He does a couple of wide turns to bleed off speed and land the X3 for the final time, redeeming himself for the rough landing on his previous flight and achieving the highest flight, beating the record set by Ivan Concello and the X2 in the previous year. A record he knows will not stand for long. December 4th, 1957. The final launch of the year. The Air Force plans to once again attempt the solar-powered satellite contract, as well as launch the first ever space research satellite. Pleiades 3 is loaded with two brand new experiments: a micrometeorite experiment meant to detect and report on the amount of times the spacecraft is struck by debris, and a Geiger counter meant to measure the radiation environment in low orbit of the Earth stretching into the higher altitudes. This mission calls for an incredibly eccentric orbit, just like the previous flight. To help prevent issues that plagued the last flight, we decided to launch with an apogee of above 300 kilometers after the first stage separation. It's good that we did that, because once again, the early AJ-10 that powers our second stage fails to light, leaving the full orbit insertion to the tiny, unguided Aero-B. With some clever flying, we are once again able to put the spacecraft into orbit and salvage the mission, but end up 50 kilometers short of the required 300 kilometers for the solar-powered satellite contract. Despite this, we complete the first scientific satellite. Data from the satellite shows that a large belt of charged particles surround the Earth at the equator. This donut-shaped belt of dangerous radiation is caused by Earth's magnetic field, trapping charged particles from the Sun into this donut shape, creating a challenge for potential deep space missions and human spaceflight, as this belt could pose a serious risk not just to the human body, but to computers and equipment carried on any spacecraft that pass through this belt.